Hey, so this is an unusual video, but I figured since I'm on vacation, I would do something a little bit more chill and, sort of take you with me on the vacation aspect of things. So I just shot a little video of a sunset the other night and figured I'd record the audio while I sit on the boat so you can hear some of the water and some of the birds and stuff in the background. So hopefully it's a nice peaceful vibe for our chat. And today we're going to chat about going into revisions and getting into, how do we prepare for draft 2 of a story after we finish draft 1. So for some context of where I'm at in my own novel, I just finished draft 1 in, end of June, maybe early July. It's start of August now, so I've been in the revision process for a while, but I'm still working through it. For some, statistics on my project, in case you're interested, I started my development at the end of 2023, right at the very end of December, and then I started drafting in August of 2024. So, a good several months there of planning, development, all that. And then from August of 2024, I wrote just about 97,000 words. My goal was 96, with 48 chapters, about 2,000 words a chapters. That's how I got my number. And it took me just about 300 days to get there, so a little less than a year. I in my writing process, I alternated between picking, whatever random vibe I felt like. In certain chapters, I wanted maybe to interact with certain characters or work in specific locations. And then I would go back and forth and fill in the gaps between those chapters afterwards to keep things relatively cohesive. But honestly, it didn't really matter for me to go perfectly chronologically because I knew no matter what, it was not necessarily going to be the most cohesive end product. And I was okay with that because there's going to be several rounds of revisions to make that cohesion come together. What really mattered for the first round was just enjoying it and getting it all down on paper. So I have had a sort of baby, and I love it dearly, but it is admittedly a very, very ugly baby. So the second half of drafting, where the intricacies of the plot really came into play and, things had to come together, just had more and more problems arise as I went on. And instead of stopping and reevaluating, I decided the best thing for me would just be to follow my existing plan, go with it, make what adjustments I had to make it possible to progress, but in general, just work with what I had and keep aware of the problems, but know that it wasn't really the time to think about fixing them. In coming into draft 2, there's a lot of different strategies that people can use. I have some of my own that I'm going to follow, but I figured I'd share some general ones so that if you are coming into the same spot of your writing process, you've got a broader idea of what you might be able to try rather than just hearing exactly what I'm planning. One piece of advice you're going to hear pretty frequently from just about anybody is to take things in stages. Some people have the inclination to open up their document, start reading, and make changes as they go. And while this can be fun, honestly, it's going to probably create a lot more knots in your story than you might have even started with, and it's not going to really end up solving a lot of the problems. I sort of think of it as similar to trying to comb out the tangles in your hair from the top down rather than starting from the bottom up. You're just compressing all of those tangles together rather than taking them out. So certainly open up your book and start reading it through and make a lot of notes, but don't necessarily go in and change anything just yet. Just, take notes on what hits you, whether it's something that you really like and think you did well or something that you think needs some shaping up. And be prepared to not tackle all problems in one singular bout or even one round of revisions. You're going to have a third, a fourth, however many drafts you're going to need. So don't feel like you've got to hit all of the smallest points. To give you some specifics, I want to share 2 particular formats that I found online that I think are helpful ways of framing this bottom-up approach where you start with the biggest problems and then work your way up to the tippy top and get those really finer points. First up is Jessica Brody, who wrote Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is a pretty well-known text for planning out a story in terms of its plot beats. She has a lot of other great insights in, her website, in her videos on YouTube, and the method that she uses for revisions, she calls the level down technique. She splits it into 3 levels. So starting with the story level, this is where she covers plot, character, and setting all together. Then she goes into scene level revisions where she focuses on the mini arcs of each individual scene or chapter. And then finally are the page level, which are the grammar, style, mechanics that make each page really sing. Breaking things down further is Rachel Geisel Grimm, who describes her process in the analogy of a body. She uses 5 steps, starting with the skeleton, the plot, what happens and how. This is mostly external plot. This might also be where elements of setting come into play, or character, the very basic elements of those that you need to get in. But really, character especially comes in the next level, the muscles and the heart. That's why everything happens the way it does, why the characters act the way that they do, really focusing on the internal plot versus the external as before. The next layer is freckles, which are detail and style added into everything to just really make it shine in a polished way. That's maybe where you would come with more of those specific details on character and setting that you might not have hit on in the earlier 2 levels. Next up is the doctor's checkup, where you look for technical operations and ensure that everything is functionally working in the way that a book should. Finally is the toning stage. This might be where she does something like beta reading, where she gives it to somebody else to get their thoughts and ensure that not only does the book look good from her perspective and look good from a technical perspective, but also reads well to others. This really focuses on how it appears in the same way that toning our body is, everything about our body should be about us, but toning is often about how it looks, right? Another important thing to consider as you get into revisions is whether you're going to take a break for a while or dive right in. Most of the time you'll see advice that champions taking a break. It allows you to break patterns and habits that you might have formed in writing that first draft, and it allows you to forget details, which coming back to the book when you go to read it for your revisions, it allows you to take on the reader's perspective more so than the author who has all the missing pieces and all the connecting dots in their head. You maybe forget some of those and realize gaps that the reader might have that you might not have noticed. However, I'm going to be honest and say that I have jumped right into my revisions, and there's a couple reasons for that are frankly a little bit less logical, but I still want to share them in case it's the path that you want to follow. First of all, I was just excited. I was thrilled to be finished with my first draft, and I wanted to keep going, keep my momentum up, and stay in the groove. Secondly, as I was writing the first draft, it's kind of inevitable that you're going to start to realize some of the huge problems woven into your initial plan. So I don't necessarily feel like I need to take a distance from the book to come back as a reader versus an author to see some of these problems. So I don't feel that as an author I need to come back and try to take a reader's perspective, because just as an author I can tell a lot of the problems that are already there. So if you are someone who, as they wrote, was already able to identify a lot of the issues, you might not need to take that break. If you have trouble figuring out what might be wrong, then that might be the better time to take a break. But really, either way, it is up to you and whether you want to give yourself some well-deserved rest or if you want to keep that groove going. One thing that's also worth mentioning on my side, the jumping right inside, is that I am very susceptible to new, shiny ideas. So it's also important to make sure that I don't lose passion for this project by stepping away from it. So what's my exact plan? Well, I'm already partway through it, so let me take you through what I've done so far. First, I did a reread, and as many guides will suggest, I read through it basically as fast as I could. I did it in about 2 or 3 sittings, and in it I focused mainly on the 3 elements of plot, character, and setting. As I read, I took notes, color-coded, of course. For plot, I focused on the logistics of how the various machinations moved, especially the antagonists and the external conflict as it progressed. For character, I focused on characterization and major thematic arcs. And for setting, I focused on world-building details just to make sure that, especially in my book, a fantasy book, that I had all those necessary details and context pieces that a reader would need to understand what's going on and what's being said. I really evaluated these elements on the basis of, are they well set up, are they fully developed, and then are they followed through in the course of the book? And is that process evenly paced and spread out without any lumps or empty spots? Then I moved on to stage 2, which is the stage I'm finishing up right now, re-envisioning. I think it's really important when we revise to really think about the meaning of that word revise as not just going back through what we have and tweaking it, but re-envisioning it from the ground up to make a new, better version of itself. The first thing that I did in this process is I focused on the notes relating to setting because I found that those would be the easiest to flesh out the empty areas, fill in details that maybe I hadn't considered in my initial world building phases, and just straighten things out that were a little bit confusing, and to keep notes in mind of how I want to integrate all that information into the story itself as I start to redraft. Then I have moved on to characters, and I've got most of my character details figured out at this point, but I wanted to go through their major details and development to ensure that the main characters had really firm, strong arcs that make sense and that can be easily traced throughout the course of the story. Finally, I'm working on brainstorming the major adjustments to plot. This is where I typically find that the most changes need to be made, especially in the earlier drafts. So for example, in this particular work, I've had to do a lot of focusing on the antagonist to make sure that her backstory, motivations, and plan are really well fleshed out, and refining the major arcs in terms of how the story moves, of course tied in with those internal arcs that I just worked out in the character section. As I've been making these notes and adjustments, I've been making sure to jot down my plans in a very rough outline, but I know that this is not the final outline I'm going to use in my redrafting. For that, I'm going to use a very in-detail template, specifically one that I adapted from a video by The Edge. I think that this template really gives all the information that one needs as an author to get into a very well-crafted chapter or scene. So let me break down the elements of that one by one. First is POV. Obviously, if you've got a book with more than one protagonist or narrator, you've got to figure out who's in charge of what chapter. But even if you're just working with one narrator, you want to figure out their attitude going into it, their point of view as a person just going into the scene. Are they angry from what happened before? Are they worried? Are they calm? Next, you have to think about the setting, both the time and the location, as well as any environmental factors going on at the time, which might influence the action or the feel of the scene. Next up is purpose. Now this is, if you're looking at things from a Watsonian versus Doyleist perspective, where Watsonian is what's going on in the story, and Doyleist is what's going on for you as an author. This is the Doyleist part, where we're looking at the meta-narrative function of the scene, what goals it's accomplishing for us as the author in getting us from point A to point B. Next are the goals, which are that Watsonian aspect, where we're focusing on what the characters want out of this scene, what they're looking to get or learn, either personally or in order to progress their plot lines. Next, we get into breaking down the action of the scene itself, starting with the beginning hook. It's really important in the beginning of a chapter, not just to rely on whatever cliffhanger or story questions that were left by the previous one, but something new and engaging to draw the reader into this new chapter. especially if you're not directly continuing the action from the previous. Building the bulk of the scene is going to be the conflict, which focuses on the characters in some kind of conflict or opposition, whether it's just they're trying to learn something, trying to talk something through, or trying to get somewhere, do something. Whatever their end goal is for this particular moment in time, we want to focus the chapter on making sure that it's going somewhere and not just a singular moment where they're just doing whatever. Maybe they're thinking about the plot, but they're not doing anything about it. There's a lot of different things that we can use as conflict in a scene, but we want to make sure that there is some kind of conflict going on. As mentioned, we do want to have some kind of cliffhanger or curiosity gap. I like that phrasing, curiosity gap, better, because it really implies that even if there's not something incredibly action-packed going on in your scene, you can leave it on a question or an idea that's going to encourage your readers to want to keep reading to figure out that knowledge. After we've gone through the basic plotline of the scene, we're going to look at the story questions and make sure that we're both asking and answering various questions throughout each scene. They don't have to be jam-packed. Some scenes might focus on just answering one previous question or putting forward a new one, but some might include lots of little story questions being answered or new ones being posed. So we want to keep track of where our characters are at and where our readers will be at in terms of what they're learning, what they're coming to find out about the story in each scene as it progresses. Obviously, we want to make sure that each one we pose in a scene later comes back with an answer. This kind of draws us back to the beginning of the scene with perspective. We finish with reactions, where we think about the character's response in wake of the scene. Now, if we're going from one scene to another that follow each other directly moment to moment, the reaction beat of this scene is going to be pretty similar to the perspective beat of the next one. But this is especially helpful when we get to points where the action may skip around, or if we have multiple protagonists, we know where we leave one when we come back to the other. So, for example, if chapter 25 focuses on one character and chapters 26 and 27 focus on others, we can come back to this reaction beat when we get to 28 and pick up and say, okay, so this is where we left off with this character. This is how they're feeling right now. This outline is not only helpful to us as an author for keeping things straight, like those story questions and that perspective, but it's also helpful for the readers as we make sure that we are offering them conclusions to all of the questions we offer and continuing the through lines of the emotional beats that we are setting up for them. We want to offer them the kind of peace and conclusion that we also want to offer our characters at the end of the story. Lastly, we have step 3, rewrite. Now, this can seem a little daunting and even a little unnecessary to someone less practiced in the revision field. Like we said with re-envisioning at step 2, it's about coming back from the ground up to make a finer product. I don't know about you, but I think of the analogy of pottery. I'm not very good at pottery, and if I was working on a project and I started it and it turned out okay, but there were changes I knew I could make to make it better, I wouldn't necessarily take that existing pot and try to shape it. I think given the problems that it already had, it'd be more likely that I would just tear the clay, collapse it, and make it worse by trying to make it better. What I'd probably do is just squish what I had and start over with the new knowledge. And that's definitely what I recommend doing as you revise, especially in the earlier stages. As you get to later and later stages of revision, you might find that you're just able to make tweaks here and there. But going specifically from draft 1 into draft 2, I think it's really important to start on an empty page and just take it from the top. What I'll typically do before I get into a second draft of a scene is I'll reread the previous one to remind myself of how that previous version of the scene went, but I won't necessarily keep it open as I rewrite the next version. For that, I'll rely on the outline that I've created, because I don't want to accidentally end up incorporating too much from that previous version and not making the changes that are necessary. I just want to have it in mind in case there's any particular lines of dialogue or prose or descriptions that I want to include from one to the other. And with that, those are my plans for revisions and my tips for general ideas you might want to consider as you get from draft 1 to draft 2. I hope that you find it helpful and interesting, and I hope you enjoy jumping into step 2 of this process as much as I am.